Yes.
Sir?
Yes, yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay, okay. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Good evening and welcome to all. This is the 6th session of the Faculty Development Program organized by History Wing, Directorate of Distance Education, Annamalai University. It is to be started now. We are happy to have Professor Arun Bandyopadhyaya as a resource person. I have the privilege to introduce Professor Arun Bandyopadhyaya. Arun Bandyopadhyaya is formerly Nurul Hasan Professor of History and Dean, Faculty of Arts, University of Calicut, University of Calcutta, and the ICSSR Senior Fellow at the Institute of Development Studies, Kolkata. And the Professor Arun Bandyopadhyaya is working as Historical and Archaeological Secretary of Asiatic Society, Kolkata. He previously taught at Banaras Hindu University, Varanasi, and Viswa Bharati University, Shantiniketan, and served as visiting professor in Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi, Ancient University, Paris, and Uppsala University, Sweden. His research interest covers a wide range of areas, including agrarian history, business history, history of science and environment. He had published innumerable works with a special reference to, we have to refer some of the works. The Story of Jeso, The Agrarian Economy of Tamil Nadu, 1820-1855, The History of Gun and Shell Factory in Kazipur, 200 years of ordnance factories production in India, tribes, forest and social formation in Indian history, science and society in India, and apart from these works, he has edited a number of volumes. Especially, we have to mention a few of them. 6 volumes of documents on economic history of British rule in India, focusing on Eastern India, Southern India in the late 19th century, all co-edited with Arun Kumar Bakshi. 6 volumes on the Northern India is in the late 19th century is the same series with the additional study of quality of life have been prepared by our Professor Arun Bandyopadhyaya, of which 3 of the volumes have come out in the year 2020. 2 of his latest books are entitled Nature, Knowledge and Development, Critical Essays on Environmental History of India, and Understanding the Ambedkar in the Passage of Time. Both these works are edited ones. His another latest publication is the Felicitation volume in 2 parts for his teacher, Professor Binay Bhushan Chaudhary, edited in entitled In Quest of the Historian's Craft, Essays in Honor of Professor B.B. Chaudhary, Part 1, The Economy, Part 2, The Polity, Society and Culture. Our Professor Arun Bandyopadhyaya was the Secretary of the Indian History Congress, and now Professor is acting as the President of the Society for Preservation, Calcutta. Now I submit the session to Professor Arun Bandyopadhyaya, and again I welcome Professor Arun Bandyopadhyaya for handling the session.
Thank you, Professor Sankari, for giving me this opportunity of interacting with the teachers of college and universities in various parts of India in this interactive session. Your actually mission is wonderful, because I think that teaching and research, as far as this discipline of history is concerned, are the most important thing on which the new practitioners of history teaching and research should devote some time. And I understand that in this session from 3rd August to 9th August, there will be several speakers on various aspects of history teaching and research. And today, my task is to give a talk on methods and techniques of effective history teaching within an hour, because my plan is to speak about 45 to 50 minutes, and then we ask for questions from the participants, and we shall again I shall again participate in the discussion, because without the interactive session, the effective history teaching would be nothing. So I'm happy to speak. I'm happy to speak on effective history teaching, which I think a theme of great importance, both for the discipline, this is very important, discipline of history, and for the general education. Uh, Now, the question is this: so what really makes effective teaching, effective history teaching, so important? Why actually Professor Sankari and his colleagues have given so much importance on this particular theme, so much that it is there in their very theme of the webinar organized by the Directorate of Distance Education, History Wing, Annamala University during this period. I had the occasion of visiting Annamala University sometime early this year in order to attend as a special guest on the 40th session of the South Indian History Congress. It is a wonderful campus, and there are so many people. I met them. It's a very interesting thing. We are talking about certain kind of research there. But today, I shall mostly talk about effective history teaching. Now, though history is part of social science, we know that throughout the second half of the 20th century, history is generally recognized as one of the very important subjects of social science. History is also, for long, believed to be a liberal arts subject. Now, as a liberal arts subject, it is being taught in the schools. As a liberal arts subject, it is also taught in the colleges. In addition to that, in the last few decades, as a social science subject, it is also being talked about in various other intellectual quarters. Now, history, therefore, is relevant to many, and of these many, there were, of course, school children of the growing ages, as well as general public at large. You should know that everybody should have some idea of history at the school level, though they may not pursue it at the later period. And at the same time, everybody, including the administrators, the politicians, the practitioners of various other disciplines, whether it is medicine or engineering or science, has a glimpse of history. And as a result, everybody sometimes speaks about history. So history is a liberal arts subject. It is not that only some very limited group of people will go through history, will learn history. History has a certain kind of pedagogy, uh, in which, of course, the specialists like you, those people who are teaching in the colleges and universities, they will participate. But we should remember that there are many people who are not at all connected with the academic world. Who are the general public. They are also talking, thinking, even sometimes writing of history. So what special duty we have when we start teaching history at the college and university level? And we should know that those people whom we teach, many of them will become the school teacher also. So our teaching should be so much effective, so that it can convert people of the general public, and it can illuminate even the children of the growing ages. So the special importance has to be given on the effectiveness of teaching at school, college, and university level. Now, as we know, that history is a concrete subject, concrete in the sense that it has to tell you a story. You cannot float in only certain sophistication, only certain logical exercise, only certain abstraction. It is a concrete subject, but we cannot avoid three things of history. As a concrete subject, we must remember of the three things of history. One is chronology, second is space, and third is persons, human beings. Now, chronology, there is a degree danger involved here. Chronology does not necessarily mean that we have to remember series of dates and dates and dates. Chronology is something more than that. Space is, of course, we have to verify that what we are talking about. Are we talking about a village? Are we talking about a city? Are we talking about a district? Are we talking about a province? Are we talking about a country? Are we talking about a continent? Are we talking about the entire globe? So space is very important. Whenever we are talking about history, we just cannot speak about in abstraction. For example, there may be various kinds of history in this world, but there is no history of the heaven. Heaven is a space which is only in imagination, not in uh, uh, actual reality in our before our eyes. So indeed, I will tell you a story that Sadar K.M. Panikkar, who started his teaching in Aligarh Muslim University long ago in 1920, and then after independence, who became India's ambassador to China, he wrote a book, a short book on history. It was called A Survey of Indian History in 300 pages for the entire history. And in his introduction, he told that why he has written, amongst many other works, why he has written this history. He told there that he was referring to certain history books, and he found that it was merely as a telephone directory, certain names not related. We cannot remember the names of telephone directory, names that occur in the telephone directory, because there are so many names, but they are unrelated. In history, we'll find definitely certain names, certain persons, but they're related. And because they're related, we remember them. So we can overcome this hurdle of chronology, space, and person. In chronology, you know that, for example, in modern Indian history, one very important event is the Battle of Plassey, when the British rule was first established in one part of India. Now, it occurred in 1757. It occurred in the month of June. And even if we forget that whether it was occurring in the month of June in 1757, we should know that it predated another event which took place 100 years later, the revolt of 1857. So if a person does not know that which one occurred first, Battle of Plassey or the revolt of 1857, he will not be able to do any kind of exercise, whether teaching or research or writing on history. So history concerned about date, but not necessarily in the very narrow sense of the term, where the date are related. It is indeed after 100 years of British rule, from Plassey to the revolt of 1857, what occurred, what has been called by some people as the first war of independence. That is to say, the revolt of 1857. So that is a different story. But these two events are related in an extent, and one event predates another. And this we should remember. Here actually comes chronology. As I told you, space also occurs, whether we are talking about a country, about a village or a district or a province or nation. We should clarify ourselves. And of course, persons. Persons means personalities, of course. Big people were there, the leaders were there, the great men were there, but ordinary men was also the very much important part of history. So if one writes the history of peasants or history of workers or history of women, sometimes they can take most ordinary men and women. It does not necessarily mean they would have to take only the very, very important persons, because in history, persons and processes are also important. Now, in this context in mind, I will first of all tell you that when you will go to teaching, and in order to make the teaching very effective, you should remember three interrelated aspects of overcoming this hurdle of how to make chronology, space, and persons very, very uh, interrelated and effective in your teaching. So in order to do this, we have to think, we have to do three things. One, the most important point is this: we have to identify a number of issues from history. You cannot take history in general. You have to, whenever you teach history, whatever history you teach, It may be nationalism, it may be workers' movement, it may be peasant movement, it may be Dalit movement, it may be religious movements, it may be caste movements, it may be various other kind of things, it may be industrial development, whatever you do, it may be agrarian history, it may be history of science and environment, whatever you may do, you have to take up certain issues from history and then analyze those issues in your teaching from all respects. You should remember that an issue might have two or three aspects of it, and you should not cover only one aspect of it. For example, whether you are talking about Gandhi or Ambedkar, you have to talk about various issues of surrounding Gandhi and Ambedkar, not only one issue. So analyze whenever you analyze a particular event, whenever you analyze a particular process, whenever you analyze a particular personality or anything relating to history, you have to analyze it from various respects, from various angles. And finally, you have to make your presentation interesting. Interesting in the sense so much that it will create certain awareness, it will create certain questions. And some people may disagree with you, some people may agree with you, some people may modify you. So you should not say that it is whatever you have stated is final. It is not 2 plus 2 equal to 4. I will not say that 2 plus 2 will make 5, like this type of things, but there are various ways to look at it. You have to think over it. But that does not mean that there is no substance in history. Now, before proceeding further, we have to remember that whenever we talk about history in the classroom, we are actually talking about past. And this past and this history may not be the same thing. Past is unlimited. Anything that occurred in the past is past. But we are not talking about everything at the same time. We are talking about something. So when we talk about history, all history is limited in that sense. It will not cover the unlimited past. Unlimited past may be very important because it was uh, not actually covered by a particular teacher, a particular writer, etc., because he is teaching, he is writing on certain aspect of it. But there are many other aspects occur at the same time. We do not register all these things. Whenever we switched over to another subject, we talk about that. For example, when we talk about Indian nationalism, we talk about certain goals, certain struggles, certain achievements of it. But at the same time, it may not be, when we talk about the history of women, emancipation of women, we talk about certain other aspects of the lives of women. And it may be that sometimes the history of nationalism and history of women may connect together. Women in a large number participating in the national movement, as in the Gandhian movements, etc., or in other kinds of movements. But it might have certain other aspects also. It might have, the history of women might have certain aspects which was not related with nationalism. So these are two different things you should remember. So we are always talking about a limited history. We are not talking about the unlimited past, what occurred. And the concrete subject of history is mixed with a number of subtle aspects to handle it. We should remember that we are not talking about only dates, we are not talking about only certain names of certain personalities, we are not talking about certain numbers, as in the case of the economic history, etc. We are also, whenever we are teaching history, we should be aware and we should make our audience to be aware that we are concerned about the philosophy of history and historiography to handle it. You know, this is very important thing. Most of you most probably have read E.H. Carr's very short book, What is History? Now, in that book, E.H. Carr has stated that whenever any person takes up a book, he actually notes two very important things. One is who is the author of the book and what is the title of the book. But he added that whenever a history student takes up a book, He of course notes what is the title of the book, and he of course notes what is the author of the book, but at the same time he also notes when the book is published, because he assumes that all history is dated. History can be written in different way at different points of time. So history, we are not saying that history is changing. We are saying that over the years, our attitude, our outlook to history may evolve, may evolve. As a result, whenever we speak something, uh, mm, something we should be very aware that all history is dated. And in that way, all history teaching is also dated. So today, even in this month, you are teaching history on certain subject, whether it is nationalism, gender question, uh, um, workers movement, or peasant movement, or Dalit movement. And in the next, and after 3 months, you can again take the same class and you will not repeat the same thing, because in the meanwhile, there may be a new work, a new article has come out. And that new article may be very important. And if you have gone through the new article, and if you think that there is something of substance in that new article, you will relate it to your teaching. So history teaching will change also from time to time. All history teaching is also, like all history is dated, all history teaching is also dated. The importance of the element of understanding and teaching of history. There are three very important elements in the understanding and teaching of history. One is fact, second is meaning, and third is interpretation. These are very important elements of our learning and teaching of history. Now, let us first explain what do you mean by facts? What do you mean by meanings? What do you mean by interpretation? You know that E.H. Carr, the book that I referred to, What is History? There is a long discussion that whether history is objective or history is subjective. Now, there is a very, very important statement of E.H. Carr in that book, and also in many other books that came out later on. For example, Collingwood's Idea of History and many other books. You will find that it is quite accepted that there is a subjective element of history. Indeed, in Agatha Christie's famous novel, in one of the famous novel, one sixth standard uh, girl student came back from school and told her father that it is a very interesting thing that all geography books more or less speak the same thing, talk about the same thing, but all history books do not talk about the same thing. There may be certain differences in the history books. And the father says that when all history books will tell you the same thing, that will be the end of history. So, generally speaking, we accept that there should be a subjective element in history, but that subjective element is not such that you can call day as the night. You cannot call that, for example, you cannot call that Battle of Plassey took place after the revolt of 1857. You cannot call this, because then you will not be able to explain what is the revolt of 1857. So there are certain elements which you cannot change. So there is an objective part of history also. There is a subjective part, but there is also an objective part. Even in sciences, hardcore sciences, even in physics, this question is now being discussed: what's the role of observer? So the role of observer was a very, very important thing on which Einstein and Tagore discussed long ago, that whether the role of observer is there or not. In history, of course, there is a role of observer. A person is writing history, and his view is very important. A person is teaching history, his view is important. But that does not mean he will teach anything, and he will not be guided by anything. So these facts, it's philosophical understanding mm, actually is various, like this, that how to define a fact in history. What you call, we just cannot say, for example, India became independent on 15th of August 1947. Now many people thought that the political freedom has come, but economic freedom has not come. So some people in those times in 1947 called in Hindi, "A Azadi Jhuta hai." That is to say, this freedom is false. But long after much discussion, it was found that as far as the political freedom is concerned, it has a reality. We have to accept this, even if we think that economic freedom has not come. So we are to identify a particular fact of India's independence on 15th of August 1947. Even if we think that etc etc and after 72 years after independence, we can again relook. 15th of August is coming back. That what has happened in India during this period. So a fact uh, a fact is something on which you can discuss, you can raise certain questions relating to certain aspects of a fact, but that does not mean that you will be able to negate that fact. That is very important, and that is a very important part of history as a discipline. If facts disappear from history, history is also lost. History is not an abstract subject. History is a concrete subject, and this concrete subject can be looked at from different kind of abstraction. That may be possible, but first of all, recognize that history is a concrete subject, and as a result of postmodernism, we have found that instead of facts, fragments, this particular word has come to reality. And even then, even if you find that there is that truth, for example, factual truth is only partial, not full, but that does not mean that you are completely negating factual truth. Indeed, uh, the entire way of looking at the fact, Collingwood has discussed in great detail in his book, The Idea of History. Now, what is an event? Collingwood said that his classic example was this: that Caesar crossed the river Rubicon. Caesar crossed the Rubicon. What does it mean? Collingwood said that when Caesar crossed the Rubicon, Roman empire expanded beyond the banks of the river Rubicon. And how do you know this? Because you are not living at the time of Caesar crossing the Rubicon. So he says that reenactment of the thought of the agent in the mind of the historian. So he came to a very interesting proposition: all history is contemporary. Indeed, in the NET examination, this question came: all history is contemporary. Do you agree? I was looking through the scripts in Baroda, and I found that one person. I do not know whether he or she. So he or she says, "I do not agree. I am an ancient historian. I am a medieval historian. How can all history be contemporary?" But he or she does not know that even if we write something of Caesar's crossing the Rubicon and its various kinds of effect, we are thinking, reenacting the thought of Caesar, reenacting the entire episode of Caesar's crossing the Rubicon River today in 2020. So history is a bridge between the past and present. So actually the past is not coming to our writing, to our teaching. Present is the mediator. So always we should remember that all historical facts should come through the mediation of the present. And as a result, nowadays sometimes some people, particularly postmodernists, said that there is no difference between history and novel because of the imagination, etc., in both these two works. But I think, for example, Amitabh Ghosh, who is the famous novelist and who has written history-based novel, if you ask Amitabh Ghosh that the book that you have written, would you call it history or would you call it novel? Amitabh Ghosh would say it is a novel. So there is certain similarities between history and novel, but all know that what is the difference. So we have to remember this, that whenever we shall discuss facts, we should remember all these things, that whatever may be the meaning of the fact, whatever how, in the way we interpret facts, we should remember that without fact, certain kind of fact, history will not be operative. Second question is meanings, a relatively new term, and it is part of cultural or linguistic term as it is now called, and its meaning, uh, actually its meaning is manifold in the sense that from the 1970s onwards, throughout the 1980s and 1990s, historians' attention was coming from economic and social history to cultural history gradually. And if you go through certain kinds of historians like William Sewell Jr., whose father was a sociologist senior and who has written a book called The Logics of History in 2005, and who participated in this entire episode, and who said that he was in the beginning as a social historian, new social historian, how he converted to cultural historian, and then he again realized that we have gone so far as a result of the fact that this identification of certain cultural aspect of everything becomes all important, and as a result, the discourse, what has been called the key word of this thing, become an orthodox matter. So orthodoxy of discourse has come. So all history, according to them, are either pronounced or hidden text. So it is nothing but the history of mind. So that is something which you cannot agree. We must have to find out that, well, there must be there must be a social fact, there must be an economic fact, and in addition to that, there must be there may be a cultural fact. So in order to give importance to the cultural fact, we just cannot ignore the social, political, or economic fact. So there is a social, political, and economic fact, and it stands on its own feet. So meanings, that means meanings may be various, but it will not go to that extent that the entire society or economy would become a text. We will not agree with that. And interpretation, the third important point. It is an exercise with familiarity with past and present. I have given you the Collingwood example, how past and present is related in history writing and history teaching. And it is both subjective, there are both subjective and objective element in it. We just cannot say it is entirely subjective. And there are many possibilities. And the imaginative aspect of historical narratives are important, but they are not all pervasive. Take the example of Hayden White. Hayden White, who was the writer of the famous book Meta History. Hayden White actually just died 2 years ago in 2018, and his book was published in 1972, and I was reading the book, the 25th edition of the book in Nehru Museum and Library, and there actually he in the new introduction, Hayden White stated that ever since the publication of the book Meta History, so many people have criticized it, but he thought that he will not change the text. In the work Meta History, he has shown that how the imaginative aspects of something actually becomes all pervasive, etc., etc. But that does not mean whether it's Tocqueville or Marx or anybody else, a person is concerned, he has a different kind of things to say, and he has a different kind of things in mind. So he actually gives more importance what things that he had in mind. So anybody might have some things in mind. You have just think about the famous historian, Cambridge historian Namier, who wrote the famous book on the Whig history, and you said that he said that the private papers, the private interest is all that important. So, for example, one person is talking about nationalism, but his private interest is to develop certain kind of personal industry, etc., etc. So his speech on nationalism is completely meaningless. Only his speech on, not his speech, but his interest, uh, personal interest on industry or some property related matters is only important. So these are the very important thing. As a result, actually, there is no history of idea. There is no history of ideology. There is no history of big things, ideals, etc. Only narrow interest coming. So what what should be, there should be a mixture of it indeed, because the narrow interest come in, but at the same time we are also speaking about the larger thing. For example, we all know that people who are in the public sphere, all people are not telling the truth. But remember, no person publicly recognize that telling lies is a virtue. Very few people publicly recognize. That means public statement, still in the public statement, telling truth is an ideal. Even if you do not tell truth. As a result, such word has come, and and the movie has also been made. True lies, true lie. What is can be a true lie? Now, history is a concrete subject, and hence everything should be based on illustration. So we have to give certain illustration from history, certain examples from history. Uh, Without examples, example is actually actual history, actual story, actual narrative. Now this narrative may change from one person to another person, from one teacher to another teacher to an extent, but this narrative, uh, in the way, in whatever way we interpret it, there should be a story in the narrative. And as a result, you know that about 20 years ago, the famous Gulbenkian Commission was appointed in Europe how to teach social sciences. And as a result of this, in 1999, a book came whose name is Open the Social Sciences. And this book was actually written by famous sociologist Immanuel Wallerstein, who was the writer, famous sociologist, who was the writer of the making of the modern world in 3 volumes. Now, it is actually the product of the 10-member commission, Gulbenkian Commission. And in the Gulbenkian Commission, the role of different subjects like history, political science, economics, sociology, and other related subjects came in. So there, Wallerstein has identified that history as ideographic, that is to say illustrative, and history as the very old-fashioned store of data. And political science or economics or sociology is nomothetic or more or less model building. They build models, they build on models, different kind of models, etc., etc. But uh, at the end of the day, he found, the entire commission also found, that there is close relationship between the social science subject, history, political science, economics, sociology, and I will also argue it is not in that book, anthropology. Now, whenever we talk about history, we give some importance to, as I told you, to 3 things. One is date, second is space, and third is persons. We talk about certain human beings, definitely. Uh, and these the interrelatedness of these 3 things, that is to say date, chronology, space, and persons, in many ways. For example, take the example of 2 very important episodes. One is in history, modern history, another is in international relations. In modern history, take the example of capitalism, rise of capitalism. And now the rise of capitalism can be uh, explained in terms of what happened in the last 500 years. Ever since the time of Renaissance and Reformation, something happened in the case of capitalism. So it is looking at something from a long historical perspective. It does not end. Nation state developed, capitalism developed, then gradually how over and above this nation state global capitalism developed, etc., etc. So capitalism, the development of capitalism is a long drawn out process. We cannot just say that in this particular year or in this particular decade capitalism did occur. But take another example of Truman Doctrine. Truman Doctrine in the international relations. And you will find that this Truman Doctrine, if you want to explain this Truman Doctrine, it can be explained even hour by hour. In 1949 or something like that, when the Truman Doctrine was first pronounced, I still remember my teacher was giving an hour by hour account of Truman Doctrine. Uh, so there are some episodes in history which can be explained hour by hour, and there are some episodes in history which can be explained even not only by decades but century by century. So both are important with regard to this. So my illustration would be mainly taken from modern Indian history, uh, and by modern Indian history I mean the last 200 years. 200 years, roughly speaking, around 1800 onwards. Indeed, when I was going to be interviewed at Vishwabharati University, Shantiniketan, Professor Ashim Dasgupta asked me a question. The question was that if you are to teach modern Indian history, from which year you will start teaching? I first answered that 1757. He said that 1757 is important only for Bengal. I said that if you do not accept 1757, the Battle of Plassey as a very important date. Then the grant of Diwani, you check. Oh, no, no, that is also only Bengal, Bihar, and Odisha. Then I said that there are other dates. Then he said, what about 1803 when Delhi was captured? I then told him that what about 1818 when the British paramountcy was when the Maratha Confederacy was vanquished and British paramountcy was declared. There may be various other kinds of date. For example, 1848 and even 1856 when the annexation of Awadh took place. So it is a long drawn out process. The annexation of uh, India by the British rule. It began from Plassey and it ended in the annexation of Awadh in 1856. And after that, the revolt of 1857 took place. So we cannot say that it is in only 1 year, but roughly speaking, the last 200 years actually was the 200 years or so, 220, 230, something like that, years are the modern Indian history here. And this type of selection is a challenge because of the fact that this is a period which is near to us and it is proximate actually also. So it is also very difficult to explain some of the processes which was which has been unfolded in this period is still unfolding. For example, emancipation of human beings. So political freedom we got, economic freedom certainly something we got. It is still various kinds of entitlement, empowerment is still going on. So empowerment of people is a thing which was definitely uh, uh, came to a certain very important point in on 15th of August 1947, but it did not end there. So it continued. So this is a very important thing. And the three analytical elements that I told you, the facts, the meanings, and interpretation, would make the interesting reading of and of course teaching of history if we place our understanding of the concrete history. History is a concrete thing, as I told you, through this kind of analytical tools like the kind of meaning, the kind of understanding of fact that we have, the kind of understanding meaning that we have, and in the way we interpret things. So it actually takes us to a deeper and stimulating level at the time of history teaching. Now, take the first case from political history, the birth of Indian nationalism. Now, is the revolt of 1857 the first war of independence? Now, this question can be discussed. We know now there is an administrative aspect of it because when India was combined together, Pax Britannica was established. It was only after that a certain kind of nationalism developed over time. Over time, it took over time. It may be that from 1857 to 1885, and even after that, even for example, the 1905, the Bengal partition, and also I think now the Tilak's centenary was uh, being celebrated. So many leaders came, and then of course Gandhi's 150th year we have just celebrated. So all these people came later on. So administrative, political, and cultural root of modern Indian nationalism is concerned. Now, as far as the cultural root is concerned, you know that it may be that Pax Britannica was a very important thing for both positively and negatively, important thing for the birth of Indian nationalism. But at the same time, we should not ignore the cultural route through which India, culturally, even long before the establishment of British rule, there was a certain kind of unity, certain kind of continuous cultural interaction from one part of India to another part, from one pilgrim center to another pilgrim center, from so many things. So if the cultural thing was not there in such a multi-linguistic country, India could not be united. So this cultural thing predates Pax Britannica. So this debate is continuing. So participation of various segments of society. For example, in 1857 revolt, it is no longer called as merely a Sepoy revolt. Even Ramesh Chandra Majumdar's book was called, when it was published in 1957, it was called the Sepoy Mutiny and the Revolt of 1857. So that does not mean that he was merely saying it was a Sepoy Mutiny. He was also saying that it was also revolt. But in addition to that, it began as a Sepoy mutiny. So the Sepoys participated, the peasants participated, aristocrats participated in this revolt of 1857, and they have multiple motives. Now, how to how to decipher the impact of the revolt of 1857? Immediately after 1857, and in the long term. Now, for example, when you are writing history of India's freedom struggle, should we give uh, so much importance should we give on the revolt of 1857? That question would, would be discussed in the teaching, but that does not mean that we cannot ignore the fact of the revolt of 1857. Even Ramesh Majumdar also did not do this. We cannot uh, ignore the various kinds of meanings of revolting. Some people, some aristocrats revolted for different reasons. Some sepoys revolted for some reasons. Some peasants revolted some another reasons. So these reasons were different. But the revolt was the only reality. So we have to look at it. The second illustration, I'll give you some further illustration one by one. The second illustration is from the history of economic development of British rule in India. Now, this is a very interesting question that that in the British rule, this question was this that uh, uh, what happened, what really happened as far as the development is concerned, what really happened during British rule. Now, this debate is not new, only happening in the 20th century. It happened even in the 19th century. Theodore Mauritian participated in it. Dadabhai Nauroji wrote the famous book on British rule in India, etc., etc. But in the 1960s, Maurice de Maurice, the famous economist and economic historian, actually opened the debate, and in that debate, three important professors participated. One is Professor Toru Matsui, a Japanese historian, Professor Bipan Chandra, who was at that time teaching in JNU, and not in JNU because JNU was not born at that time. Actually, he was teaching in Hindu College at that time, and Tapan Rai Chaudhuri, who was teaching in the Delhi School of Economics. So all of them participated in that, and Maurice de Maurice argued that around 1800, India's economic development was not very praiseworthy, and 150 years of British rule from 1800 to 1950 was not a long time, and some progress was made, and which is achievable, uh, which is which is laudable. But when Tapan Rai Chaudhuri commented on it, Tapan Rai Chaudhuri said that, well, 150 years is a short time for gestation. A human child is of, born only after 10 months of gestation in mother's womb. And whenever certain economy in the history of industrial revolution from one country to another country, we have seen some country was took off only in 20 years, some 30, some 50 years. 150 years is a long time. It is not a short time. So Tapan Raichuri's argument was like this. Bipan Chandra was trying to argue that, well, by 1800, India was not very underdeveloped. By international standard, India was fairly developed. And so in the next 150 years, India lagged behind. And Toru Matsui said that Japanese historian that there are various explanations of it. One explanation is this, that because of British rule, it has declined. Some explain because of Indian society's backwardness, it has declined. So there are various kinds of things. So we should make a very proper analysis of all those factors. And if we do that, we just cannot say that India progressed very well during British rule. Now, in this debate, of course, the fact of underdevelopment around 1800, as far as India is concerned, was discussed. So ultimately, Maurice de Maurice had to agree that certain pockets of India around 1800 were fairly advanced, Machilipatnam or Surat, etc., or Bengal, for example, in terms of weaving industry, etc., etc. So and the nature of development, its meaning, and finally, the question of interpretation, the question of what is the time of gestation, how much time should be needed for gestation. So both fact, meaning, and interpretation are relevant while discussing this question, this debate of economic development during British rule in India. A slightly different debate on the changing standards of living in India. You know, the standards of living is a subject which has been debated and discussed even in the case of United Kingdom, UK. You know that during the Industrial Revolution, did the workers' condition improve or not? On this, there is so much discussion, and there are division between the optimists and the pessimists. Optimists think that there are certain signs of improvement. Pessimists think that in spite of certain ostensible sign of so-called improvement, there was actually decline, etc., etc. And there are some people, optimists were mostly using statistical data, pessimists were mostly using the qualitative data, and Habakkuk and etc. They were optimists to an extent, and E.P. Thompson, for example, who was a pessimist, etc., etc. So all this question came there. Now in India also, whenever this question of these changing standards come, we should remember that this entire meaning of the standards has changed over time. What should we say? The standard of a person, standard of a community, standard of a region, or standard of a village, merely in terms of the per capita income of that person, of that village, of that locality, or also the supply of certain kind of facilities. For example, your personal income is higher than somebody else's. For example, India's personal income is higher than, for example, Sri Lanka's. But if we find that the primary health center, for example, is nearer in Sri Lanka than in India, or just the opposite, nearer in India and than in Sri Lanka, so we can say that that people here living better, because whenever you have some problem, you have to go to the primary health center. Here, the only money will not help you. The primary health center can be 4 miles away, 4 kilometers away from your place. It can be 16 kilometers away from your place. So if it is 16 kilometers away from your place, in spite of the fact that your actual economic income was higher, you are not in a better place. Your standard is not higher. So the entire question of standard, here the quality and quantity and quality question has come. And indeed, in this way, actually we have found that not only Amartya Sen, that who got the Nobel Prize in 1998, long before Amartya Sen, Pigu in 1925, Pigu first talked about welfare economics, and how this welfare economics is very much important in the discussion of the standards, has been very much connected with the discussion of the living standards in India. And the documents that Shankari was referring to, the one kind of work, the documents of on economic history and quality of life that we are being produced. Professor Amiyo Kumar Bakchi, the famous economist, and me are editing these volumes, and we have already published 2 volumes on Eastern India in the late 19th century, 4 volumes on Southern India in the late 19th century, and 3 volumes on Northern India as part 1 of the late 19th century. So 4 plus 2, 6 plus 9 volumes have already been published, and another 3 volumes would be published very soon. So in that, we have discussed, along with economic conditions, quality of life. Quality of life, for example, in Northern India, as well as we are now doing the work on Western India. So these are coming in. So when we are discussing this, it is not merely in terms of per capita income. It is something more than that. For example, female education. So if the female education is higher in one place, actually that place standard is higher. Because mother's education is more important than father's. So all these questions are coming in. So as a result, what happened, that whenever we are discussing about the history of the standards of people, whether it is before independence and even after independence, we have to look after various other kinds of things beyond that per capita income. Per capita income, of course, is important. How much income some families, some persons are doing. But in addition to that, there are certain other factors. So we have to look at it. Now, By the same way, one very important episode of 19th century India was the recurrence of famines. We have explained famines took place even in the pre-colonial period, during the Mughal period. Famines took place in the early British period, and analysts have noticed that there is a frequency of famines in India in the 19th century. Now, what is the exact connection between a scarcity, where actually first things become scarce, and then famine when things are unavailable? So, what is the relationship between poverty, scarcity, and famine in the 19th century? Here we have again will come to the analytical factors: fact, meanings, and interpretation. So there are multiplicity of famine, and as a result, there are some analogy in which we have found that famine is so important that it was always the conditions. Certain regions of India were prone to famine, with slight natural disaster, with slight aspects of loss of rainfall, etc., etc. Suddenly, famine comes. So this is a very important thing, and also famine relief is a very important thing. You know that in 1943, in the Bengal famine of 1943, lakhs of people died on the streets of Calcutta. Even my teacher, B.B. Chaudhuri, who was 12-year-old at that time, told me that he found people were dying in various parts of Bengal at that time, even at a 12-year-old boy. So this is very important thing. And also,
Sir, your voice not audible. Sir, you have some network problem, sir. Sir, your voice is not clear. Sir,
Hello? Hello?
Sir?
Can you hear me?
Yes, sir. Now you're okay, sir. Continues.
Okay. So I was giving certain examples how to teach history and concrete example, because history is a concrete subject. I've already discussed, for example, how Indian nationalism question coming in, that part, how the economic development, that part, how the standards of living, that part. And in addition to that, I now take up uh, certain other questions. One is the relationship between poverty, scarcity, and famine. And you know that the famous, for example, the Famine Commission was established in 1880. But before that, the great famine that in 1878 took place in southern India. In our 4 volumes, Southern India volumes, we have discussed that. And some famines also took place in Eastern India in the 1870s. And we have found that the famine relief center, how they are operating, you know, that is a very interesting thing. And the thing, it came much later. There was a question of how much food is actually required to make a person's living with certain kind of strength, etc. All these questions, the medical question and other questions, became important during this time. So, in the entire question of famine relief and the relationship between poverty, scarcity, and famine were becoming important. And whenever we discuss that kind of fact, that kind of thing, again, this relationship between fact, meanings, and interpretation were becoming more and more important. Take another example from economic history, and this is the question of land ownership. For example, the word term Jamindar. Now, the Jumindar is a term which has a particular kind of meaning in Bengal, a different kind of meaning in northern India, and also in predominantly Rayatwari areas of southern India, a different kind of meaning. Indeed, Bengal Jamindars were large holders of land. Some of them were holding land which was more than a district. But in northern India, Nurul Hasan, famous Professor Nurul Hasan, described 3 types of Jumindars in Mughal India, and one of them was just village Jamindar who is actually holding a village, nothing more than a village landlord, nothing more than that. But in Bengal, this Bengal, Bihar, and Odisha, after permanent settlement, you will find that 15 Jamindars held 60% of land, only 1/5. That means each Jamindar holding more than a district. And in southern India, some of the Jamindars like Pudukottai Jamindars are very big, but there are actually other were Mittas, etc. And most of the areas were Rayat. And even this Rayat word, Buttonstein has described it, that Rayat is also a very mysterious term. So Rayat may not be the holder of a 1 or 2 or 3 acres of land, as in the case of the district of Salem and Coimbatore. But it may be some of the riots of Tanjavur were actually holding more than 25,000 of acres of land. So he is also technically riot. So riot, this word does not necessarily mean he is a very small person. He may be, large number of them may be small, but some of them are very big. Similarly, large number of Jumindars were very small, but some of them may be very big. So this word, Rayat and Jamindar, had different kind of meanings. And as a result, our interpretation of different kinds of changes, like the privileged landholding, Mirasi landholding, and how that famous Timin Heer's report on the condition of the pariahs in Chengalpattu district, etc., became so much important in the 1890s. So these are very important. So when we discuss this question, even in Mirasi, some people were big Mirasidars, like in Tanjavur or in some parts of Chengalpattu or South Arcot in the 19th century. But some people are very, very small privilege holders, one village or something like that. So that we have to remember. And this probably David Wasbrook has ignored. As a result, in his the emergence of provincial politics, he thought that all privileged landholders, Mirasi holders, were magnates. All of them were not magnates. Only some of them are magnates, could be magnates. Now coming back to the again stopped. Hello.
Audible only, sir. Continue, sir.
Yes. So some of the uh, magnets were actually, some of them were magnets. Now coming back to peasant villages and forest ones, because this is a very important relation between peasant and forest villages. Now when the famine were coming, we have found in the 19th century, earlier, ওয়েবনারে ব্যস্ত আছি, পরে কথা বলছি, হ্যাঁ। Some of the um, things which are very important, like this famine did not take place in uh, such rigor in the forest villages prior to 1870s. Why? Because of the fact that these so-called forests, how they came under government control. So there are reserve forests, there are protected forests, and more forest people lost their right to resources, forest resources. So when they lost their right to forest resources, during the time of scarcity or famine, they became uh, they became hungry and they could not get any fruits. Earlier, they could easily took forest fruits during the time of scarcity or famine. But after 1870s, when this reserve forest and the protected forest were established, the forest people's right to get the forest resources at ease became very much hampered. So this is also became very important. Vinita Damodaran has written about this in the light of Chotanagpur, and one of the and that article is particularly included in the book that I have edited in 2016. That is to say, nature, knowledge, and development. So Vinita Damodaran has written that. Now coming back to social issues. Now one important area was, of course, social reform. You know, in the 19th century, and the social reform history is very interesting. It began from the abolition of Soti to the widow remarriage movement, in which Vidyasagar as well as B.Rajalingam took very important part, and female education. And much later in 1892-93, age of consent bill, Tilak was very much important at that time in age of consent bill. And then much later in the 20th century, around 1929, the Sarda Act, when the age of marriage of women was fixed as 14 for the first time in Sarda Act. Now, social reform was earlier attempted from above, and social mobilization from below gradually took place, and women's emancipation was advocated by men, and later on women's emancipation was demanded by women. Now, as a result, a debate has come out in feminist history that under whose inspiration some changes have taken place. Whether some changes have taken place in the life of women at the inspiration of men. So then they are thinking that it is an influence. But then, yes, it is important. But at the same time, here also a fact we have to note that whether the emancipation has taken place or not, who was the catalyst for this, we can discuss later on. So that is a different thing. That has a different kind of meaning, of course, whether women was actually leading it or men were leading it. But the question, more important question, were the lives of women were changing or not. That is very, very important. Indeed, this is not a debate in which only India was participating. This debate was very important because of the fact that in the case of the return, Natalie Davis, who wrote that famous book, Return of Martin Guerre, uh, in the 14th century. And Martin Guerre, when he returned to his village, his wife declined that her husband. So the court was, the case went to the court, and finally the court actually condemned Martin Guerre's wife, etc., etc. So when Natalie Davis was explaining that Martin Guerre's point of view as the symbol of feminist point of view in the American historical review, the question was this: even before the birth of feminism, how can feminism come? So all these questions, and similarly the caste question. In the caste question, that Gandhi has looked at it at a one point of view. Ambedkar has looked at it at another point of view. And that in spite of the fact that ultimately both wanted abolition of caste in the long run or in the short run, Gandhi changed over time, but Ambedkar was adamant from the very beginning on this thing. Indeed, Gandhi was initially a tacit supporter of Varnashram, and then gradually he changed and said that Varnashram is not a fundamental aspect of Hinduism. And but uh, but Ambedkar from the very beginning said that even before someone become a Hindu, he belongs to a caste. He or she belongs to a caste. Now this has happened because of the personal experience. Ambedkar, in spite of his great achievement, Western education, etc., he was discriminated. Gandhi was also discriminated in Patna when slightly discriminated when he went for Champaran movement, but his experience was not uh, uh, that uh, great. So this is very important. So we have to look at it. So in this way, and also, finally, if we come to the India's struggle for political freedom and attainment of independence and the changes at the community level over the long term, we find that there are issues: class versus community, economy versus culture. Several questions remain unanswered. The history of the working class, the peasant mobilization in the national movement, the great debate between uh, the the great start my video. Uh, the great debate between my the great debate between Majid Siddiqui and Ganendra Pandey in the 1980s, etc., etc., before the subaltern studies were born, and finally in the subaltern studies. So all this question, and even in today's pandemic, for example, the role of community is very important. There is how this we are harding of community spirit, etc., both as a positive and negative thing, and this is a new dimension. So actually, the point is this: that shift there is shift of emphasis, and this teaching the shift of emphasis we should remember. explain what is the meanings, historical meanings that we decipher and interpretation. That we advocate. Now, that does not mean that none of these elements should be avoided. That means we should avoid fact, or we should avoid meanings, or we should avoid interpretation. So, a combination of these three things, fact, meanings, and interpretation, will make history teaching stimulating and provocative. So, this is my presentation, and I would like to get the feedback from your side, and if any question comes, I'll try to answer to the best. Thank you very much.
Dear participants, you can post your questions through chat box.
We are at the final stage of the session. We have to thank Professor Arun Madhavadhyaya, formerly Professor of History, Dean Faculty of Arts, University of Calcutta, for his elaborate and excellent presentation. Professor has said that history is a concrete subject based on illustrations, but not on lies. He has also made a louder statement that history teaching is a challenging, but at the same time, a subject to be have some enjoyment as well as neglect. Thank you, sir, for your excellent and elaborate presentation. And I also thank our participants for their sincere participation towards this